Thank you very much. My name is unimportant, but it is Nick Girdler, unfortunately. 40 years ago, Portsmouth City Council came to me and said, could you write us a show to commemorate D-Day? We're opening the Square Tower in Portsmouth for the first time in 50 years. And we'd like you to write a play and put it on for us during the commemorations of the 40th anniversary. I said, crikey, why me? I said, well, you've done these things before, written history shows before and performed them in Southampton, and we think they're pretty good. We can have a go at that. So I wrote this show for the Square Tower, and we recreated the map, the D-Day map, that many of you will have probably been along to see at Southwick House. I got into Southwick House 40 years ago and did a big copy of that map and hung it in the Square Tower so that we could use it to move all of the ships about that were there for D-Day. So I spent about 6 months researching D-Day, and then when I asked Portsmouth City Council, why are you doing that this year? They said, we think this will be the last year that Americans will pay to come over. Anniversaries, the BBC will tell you, are only on noughts and the 2 5s, 25 and 75. After that, we forget about them. This village doesn't. This village remembers and commemorates them. And long may it continue, because we are here to celebrate, because what they gave us is what we're celebrating, freedom. What we are here to do is to commemorate as well, because many of them didn't come back. The 4 people sitting around this table have a great responsibility of carrying on the legacy of their ancestors. Their ancestors were Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander of Operation Overlord. Marshal of the Air Force Lord Tedder, he was the Deputy Supreme Commander, Operation Overlord. Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, overall commander of all the land forces during Operation Overlord. And Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, he was the naval commander of Operation Neptune, which was the seaborne invasion prior to Overlord. There's a very famous photograph taken at Southwick House of those 4 people sitting around the table where the discussions about how they were going to organise D-Day took place. On my left, Susan Eisenhower. Not only the granddaughter of Dwight D. Eisenhower, but in her own right, an international security expert. Appears on numerous television programmes and is consulted on a regular basis by people who want to know about international security. She's an expert in that regard. On my right, Richard Tedder, Professor Richard Tedder, noted virologist and microbiologist, and a man who doesn't retire. He's still working on it, and he was still working on it during the COVID crisis as well. He is an eminent virologist. On my extreme left, Viscount Montgomery of Alamain's grandson, Viscount Henry Montgomery, 3rd Viscount Montgomery of Alamain, a man who I met just before breakfast this morning. What a nice man. Hello, he said, I'm Henry. End of story, and that was it. And of course, Montgomery there as overall commander of the land forces. And then on my extreme right, Will Ramsey. Will is actually creator of a company called Affordable Art Fair. If you want to buy art after the programme, he's the man to talk to. He's extremely good at it, and he's travelled all the way down from Scotland to see us. 2 of these people, on my left, Susan and Richard, Susan and Henry, have just returned from France, and I wanted to ask them, before I asked about other things, what their experiences were in France, because many of you will have seen the television coverage, but these 2 were there right from the beginning. Susan, can I ask you first of all your experience of what happened over there?
Well, first, hello?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Well, first of all, it was remarkable to see that the crowds were so substantial. I think I've never seen crowds like that, and I made my first trip there in 1979, and have been going regularly ever since. But I will say, before Henry offers his observations, that between the 2 of us, we covered all 50 miles of the beaches, right?
We did.
Yeah. So I was very touched by having lengthy conversations with many of the veterans, mostly, I guess, American veterans in this case, because I was operating from Bayeux through St. Mary-Église. And I did go to the British sector twice. I always go to the British sector. I want you to know that. It's very important to me. But I would say that they were remarkable, all of them. And one veteran said to me, "I want to dance. Where's the music?" And I said, "Shall I see if I can arrange that?" And he said, "Only if you'll dance with me." Okay. Wow. Yeah, so, but we had a remarkable time. We did a couple of things very quickly, aside from dining with veterans every evening. We went to an unveiling of a statue to Dwight Eisenhower in St. Mary-Église, I think in recognition of his airborne decision. And then we we enjoyed an allied ceremony in Bayeux to mark the multinational nature of this campaign. And then I went to Shellburst, which they don't really qualify to be part of the D-Day moment, but they were Dwight Eisenhower's forward headquarters at a place called Shellburst. And there, of course, General Montgomery came, and they had consultations. Winston Churchill came to that camp, so did Charles de Gaulle. And so, again, it is an outpost of strategic leadership at the highest levels. It was at that camp that the future of the Paris liberation was discussed and negotiated.
Not your first time in France, either.
No, I go, I actually take a group of undergraduate students to those beaches. I've been doing this for 15 years, but not every time do we go to Normandy. I will say that the students who went to Normandy are by far and away the strongest cohort of students I've had. It's highly impactful, because I start out by saying, you know, the boys who came on shore were your age. And then I like to put them at Omaha Beach at low tide, make them carry 70 pounds on their backs, and then I go up in the bus and sit at the top of the hill, answer my email and have a cup of coffee, and a couple of hours later, they're all straggling up and I say, you weren't even under fire. Okay.
Isn't great. Henry, your memories of France, having just returned.
Yes, well, to my shame, I didn't go to the American Quarter this year. I normally do, to the American beaches, but this year I didn't. But we started I travelled with a group of 9 Normandy veterans, and I travel every year with them. I have done for the last 8 or 9 years. And we started in Caen. Caen was heavily bombed, as you probably know. Sort of 40% of the buildings in Caen were destroyed. 4,000 Caen citizens died in the bombings. And we were given a rapturous welcome, which is sort of hard to comprehend. We then we visited Pegasus Bridge, so we did a tour that sort of started at Caen and ended up at Aramoche, which is at the eastern end of Gold Beach. So we went along the whole coastline and had a lot of, we had ceremonies at various places all along the way, commemorating the fallen. And you know, what's really moving is seeing the veterans, particularly seeing the veterans when they find their friends. And it's whether it's at the British Normandy Memorial itself, or whether they go, when we sometimes have an opportunity to take them individually to find the grave of a friend. And we always travel with a pipe band, and one of the pipers comes and stands behind and plays a lament whilst they stand. You can see them visibly emotional because of, you know, the memories. And one of the things they all say when you ask them what they remember, and they see their friend as an 18-year-old. That's what they remember. So it's very moving. And the other thing that's extremely moving is the welcome, which Susan will have experienced, of the welcome we get from the French I mean, the streets are lined. There are citizens of France in tears coming up and thanking the veterans. And what is so moving about the French is the way that they have passed the story on to their children. Yesterday, I was with one veteran whose tank was blown up just outside a village that they were trying to capture, and he wanted to find the place where his tank was blown up. We only had a very inadequate description of where that place was, and we eventually found it. It was by a large crucifix, and he crawled out of his tanks in the minutes, seconds I think he had before it went up. And he was lying in the ditch. He recognised the ditch. The ditch was still there. And we then went into the town, had a cup of tea. The cafe owner was asking why we were there. We told her the story. She rang the mayor. The mayor came along. And the next thing there was the veteran. We wheelchaired him into the primary school. And he was in the primary school telling the children, this was sort of 10 or 11-year-olds, telling the children about what he'd done, the mayor translating, and I don't think it would be allowed in this country. You know, we hadn't got our CBR checks or anything like that, and we were in there taking photographs. That wouldn't have been allowed either, and it was absolutely brilliant. So really moving occasion. So it's a privilege to be with them. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Richard, one of the things that we've been hearing stories this weekend from veterans who go through, and you will have probably seen them on the television, where sometimes they're asked a question and it takes a long time before the answer comes out. And sometimes it's a wiping away of a tear, and it's a memory that is so vivid in their memories that it does bring back pictures that can be very emotional. The other thing that occurs when it's not an anniversary like that, when you don't have an interrogator, is a great reluctance of those that were there to actually speak about what happened. And I wondered, Richard, whether you found that with your father.
In the general sense, I think the relationship between a son or a child and a parent is always a rather fractious relationship. There are boundaries within which you're safe, out with which you are seriously unsafe. With Dad, I was very much younger, and he was born in 1890, so by the time I was a child, he was already, I don't like using the word old, but he was in that sense. I have a regret, which I'm sure many people in this room will understand, that I never sat with him at his feet and said, "Hey, Dad, tell me about it." Quite why I never did that, I don't know. Maybe I wasn't looking forward enough, maybe I was too young. I even matriculated on his finger when he was Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. You matriculate on the head of the university, and I had his little finger and did the sort of kissing it and everything like that. But even then, even after that, I never sat with him and asked him, and I find it humiliating to have to say that. I mean, clearly, I have some relics from him, and I don't know if you want me to...
Please do tell us what you've got.
Well, I have in front of me, and it's dated the 3rd of June, 1944, when it was prepared. And that is the weather forecast for the first of the 4 days, the 4th, 5th, and 6th of June, 1944. And what it shows is you've got areas where you can, for those of you who are pilots, that's clear air, and you could fly there completely. Where it's blue, this bit, it's blind, but it's navigable because you've got area underneath the cloud, and you can get up into the cloud and you're blind. But the further north you go and the further east onto the continent, it's non-operational, which means you'd be very foolish to be up there because you couldn't see what you're doing, and there's high ground. And that was forecast for the 4th, prepared on the 3rd, and I've got the 5th and 6th, and they're very similar. But there is this area of visual area coming up, which was expected to extend up and give one operational flying over the channel, which was absolutely essential. Bearing in mind, you've got the three forces. You've got the Navy to look after the transport across and coordinate that, and to monitor the getting on and getting off. You've got the armed land forces who are wanting to be kept dry, getting on and getting off. And you've got the chaps above who are to keep the opposition from coming and knocking life out of you. And to some extent, I think the weather was on our side in the sense that the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, took one look at the weather maps and said, the opposition are not going to be flying in that. And yet we were flying in that. And we provided the air cover and air defense which you needed to get across and with as little damage as possible. And I have these maps there, if people want to see them. I also have from Dad's staff car the insignia and flags. So those are the sort of relics that I carry with me.
Yes. As a son, I mean, you've gone into medicine, virology and everything else. Never ever a thought to go into the Air Force then?
Well...
Wasn't expecting that one.
No, because I'm an aviator. I do fly.
Ah, he does fly.
I do fly. And that's all down to my lady wife who's sitting here. We went to buy dog food and parked in the Rochester car park. And I was watching these osters and little things, I forget what Dad called them, tiddly moths or something, flapping off like this and coming down to land. And Leslie, bless her, said to me, "You obviously want to fly." And I said, yes. And I had a trial lesson, and I came back with a map book, headset, and everything else under the sun, and sort of...
In the blood, you see?
Yes, it was.
Absolutely, definitely. Right. Will, grandson of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, unfortunately could never meet him because he died, unfortunately, in an air accident in 1945. Lots of legacies around here, though, to your grandfather. HMS Collingwood, for instance, down the road in Fareham. Their apprenticeship centre is named after him, of course. And I think you were there at the opening, weren't you? Did they ask you?
My father.
Your father was there at the opening. I know arts are your programme. You don't sail by any chance, do you? You don't sail. Not even taken up sailing, no. But again...
Competent crew is the, or day skipper is the extremity of my experience.
Right, day skipper. Well, I've managed to make beyond that, so we could talk sailing after we've done this, but we won't bore these people. Didn't meet grandfather, but did father talk about what he'd done during this period in his life?
My father didn't talk much, and I knew this question was coming, so I thought, what am I going to say? And so I found some quotes from my grandfather's diary of what he was feeling at the time. And so if you'll indulge me, I've got 4. The first is from a week before D-Day. He was overlooking Portsmouth Harbour where he could see the ships loading. And he said, "It is a tragic situation that this is a scene set for terrible human sacrifice. But if out of it comes peace and happiness, who would have it otherwise?" And you know, you can imagine being responsible for that many lives and worrying that you'd made the right decisions to minimise death, ultimately. On the evening of the 5th of June, the eve of D-Day, he wrote in his diary, "I am under no delusions as to the risks involved in this most difficult of operations, and the critical period around H-hour, when, if initial formations of landing craft are held up, success will be in the balance. We shall require all the help that God can give us." And I think that, you know, both those quotes convey the worry that they had. We had the benefit of hindsight. We knew it succeeded. and they didn't. On the 6th of June, D-Day itself, he wrote in his diary, "Everything remarkably good and better than we could have expected, but we still have to establish ourselves on land. Anxiety exists as to the position on shore. Still, on the whole, we have much to thank God for this day." And I think in that era, I think it was quite, I think being any leader is difficult, whether you're a lance corporal or an admiral or a general. You can't often open up and show vulnerability to your superiors or subordinates. And it was in an era of communications where you couldn't have the immediacy of a telephone conversation with your wife or on social media. And they only really had letters, the slow responsiveness of letters. So I think the pressure they must have felt must have been immense. And then by way of relief, he wrote a letter to his wife, Margaret, on the 12th of June. "No doubt it is natural to congratulate the head of the concern," and he's referring to Operation Neptune, the naval part of Operation Overlord, "but it only serves to remind me of the many people on whom success depended quite as much, if not more, than on myself. At the same time, I realised that in the event of failure, it will equally be all attributed to me." And, you know, yes, they were significant cogs, our forebears, but it was a cog of so many pieces, of so many thousands of people, and every little role was so important.
Absolutely, and of course your grandfather responsible for the evacuation from Dunkirk as well, and brought out of retirement in order to do that.
Yes, so he had a fallout with his boss in 1936, who we would now call a control freak, Admiral Backhouse. But he then, and so he was in semi-retirement, or he was put on the retired list. But in the event of war, Backhouse, who was by then Admiral of the Fleet, placed him to be Flag Officer Dover. And that was because my grandfather had been in the Dover Patrol in World War I, so he knew that area of the Channel well, and the challenges and where mines needed to be laid and so on. And so there was, I remember reading as well another letter to his wife about what he arrived to, and he said, there was no telephones, very little stationery, and a lot of passed over, semi-retired people. And I think it was only 8 months later, and he obviously had a lot to think about, and he fortunately saw that the British Expeditionary Force may need to be withdrawn, and so he prepared for that, including, and he had to do a lot of lobbying to the Admiralty to get as many ships as they could provide. He also put the call out for the little ships, as they became known, because they were able to reach the beaches and bring people from the beaches back to the larger ships in deeper water. And they were hoping to rescue 40,000. In the end, the incredible force that it was, with Admiral Tennant, he was then Captain Tennant, as the beach master, leading operations in Dunkirk. They rescued 338,000 troops, British and French, and Churchill did a fair bit of negotiating as to how many French were brought home as well. What, from a British perspective, what was important is that they were able to bring back the core of the professional army, who were then able to keep us in the war until such time as the conscripted and volunteer army was built up. And so it was his biography in the 1950s was called Full Cycle because he had brought back the British forces or the Allied forces in 1940 and then sent them back to France again in 1944.
And you have a copy of the book?
I do.
Good. Excellent. Henry, there's a meeting in New Year's Eve, 1944, and your grandfather has a meeting with Winston Churchill, a man that you don't argue with, so they tell me. And he said to Churchill he was teetotal, and he never smoked, and he said he showed total disdain for Churchill because of this, and said, I'm 100% fit. And Churchill said, yes, I do smoke, and I do drink, and I'm 200% fit. Is that the memory you have of your grandfather?
Not particularly exactly like that, because I was not of drinking age when I knew him. What I do have of my grandfather as a memory is a man with a great sense of humour, actually.
Really?
And so I know that's not always portrayed. That's not always his public image. But as a granddad to Bella, my sister, and I think his humour and his sort of teasing was what stands out as a memory to me.
But was he, like I've asked the other two questions, somebody who came forward with what he'd done during the war, or was he again one of those reluctant to speak about it?
Well, I have no real memories of actually him talking particularly about his experiences in the war. Probably that's because I didn't, to my shame, ask the right questions. So I don't really know if it was a sort of no-go area. But I don't have memories of that. What I have clear memories of, because after the war he kept his campaign caravans, which were parked up here in the preparation for D-Day, and then became his headquarters in Normandy and moved as the front moved. And they were in a long shed in his garden, and Bella and I, it was our playpen.
You played in them.
We played in them. So.
Yes, great. So those memories are there, but you must have then realised at some stage, golly, he was a much more important man than he was telling me.
Yes, I'm a slow learner, and but I did pick up a few vibes early on, yes. That he was sort of quite important, But the sort of things that when I was very young perhaps scarred me in a way, because I remember going to the Royal Tournament with him when he was taking the salute, and we came down this very slow lift that comes down from the Royal Box into the bottom of Earl's Court, and there was a sort of red carpet laid out, and I was sort of walking along. I think I was 5 at the time, holding his hand, and there were all these crowds of people patting my head and isn't he sweet type of thing. So those are probably the less good memories of so slightly intimidating memories. But yeah, so I think I realised that he was an important person, but I didn't really realise his significance. And to be fair, I didn't really it's not actually really it's probably in the last 10 years, truthfully, that I have realised how adored he was by his soldiers. And obviously the time I've spent over the last, since then, with the veterans, I really have understood that he was, they absolutely adored him.
Yes, and that, I think, the reason actually he was brought into the fore on this particular operation, because of that love that the soldiers had for him after El Alamein, they absolutely adored him. The country did as well.
Yes. I don't think his colleagues or superiors adored him, but certainly the soldiers did.
Yes, very much so. In fact, it was at that very meeting when they actually first discussed Operation Overlord that he looked at the entire plan and just off his head said, it's wrong. The beachhead is too narrow. And at the end of that meeting, they added Sword and Utah Beach as a result of that, which showed his ability to actually say, I can plan trip, this is how it should be going.
Yeah.
And adding those 2 extra beaches certainly made the difference on that occasion.
I think it certainly did, and I mean, there's a I think you'll have probably seen it, but there's a little square of paper on which he basically, in pencil, wrote the outline of the whole plan of D-Day, well, his vision of how the land forces would work, and at the bottom it's basically keep it simple. Yeah. And that was the one that was delegated out, that obviously everybody else did put the detail on. But that was his,
Yeah. Susan, your grandfather, of course, comes on to become President of the United States and takes over the White House, of course. And you lived there for some time with him.
Well, we didn't actually live with him. We lived in Washington, D.C., but I knew my grandfather very well. I mean, very well. After his White House years, he retired to a farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and we lived on an adjacent property. So for certainly every bit of 8 years, I saw him 3 or 4 times a week. I was the family horseback rider, and he had an enormous interest in horses. And it was in Gettysburg that a couple of things occurred to me about this war, maybe 3 of them. First of all, he didn't talk about the war, but if you asked him, he would answer questions. So at one point, I asked him about D-Day, and I got the 12-year-old version of what happened and how the beaches worked. He himself had Utah Beach added to the plan and the airborne troops because of the importance of Cherbourg as an objective for American troops. And there was extraordinary cooperation, by the way, between Montgomery and Eisenhower over this plan. So he didn't talk about that kind of thing. But I find out later that everybody in our household had been with him in some way during the war, and especially on D-Day. His valet was a member of his household at that time. Sergeant John Money went into retirement with Dwight Eisenhower and was the first African American to be a pallbearer at any president's funeral. African American John Money stood right next to all of the other generals who came to carry that casket. Also managing the Eisenhower farm was General Arthur Nevins, who was one of the rapporteurs the night the decision was made. He managed the farm. And then another driver who came to help out took Eisenhower to see the 101st Airborne Division and the other airborne units the night the troops took off. So I was surrounded by people who were intimate parts of this story, but did not fully understand all of that until later. I would say that Gettysburg also represents for me a place where I understood the bonds that had been established during that war with his comrades, the ancestors of whom are sitting right here. So I hope I'm not embarrassing you here, Richard, but Dwight Eisenhower was his godfather, which is just wonderful. You said something about whether or not your grandfather was adored. I can tell you my grandmother adored your grandfather. You know, they had this little patter, this little repartee, and Mamie was the best at it. So, do you mind if I tell the story?
No, do tell
about
me.
the White House. So, actually, Monty came to the White House several times, or a couple of times. He came to the Eisenhower farm a couple of times, and actually spent Thanksgiving dinner with the Eisenhowers in 1954. This is President Eisenhower. Get this, at Augusta National Golf Course. That's fun. But anyway, Monty came into the White House apparently and looked around and said, well, it's not Buckingham Palace. And my grandmother, she had these fantastic, large china blue eyes, and she batted her eyelashes and said, well, darling, thank goodness for that. She told me that he, of all of her house guests over the years, was her #1 favorite. So that's great. So the final thing I would say, in learning about it, I think this is a sort of a serious note here. If I have any worry for the future telling of this story, it's that we might try and appropriate it for contemporary uses. On the 10th anniversary of D-Day, my grandfather was President of the United States. And of all the American presidents who ever went to the beaches of Normandy, he had a right to be there. But he declined to go. He declined to go because he was now in the middle of a big partisan thing going on in the United States. He was fighting his own party around their propensity to be isolationists. And he wasn't going to score any points in the big political scene by politicizing what happened on those beaches. So he invited General Leonard Giraud to the Oval Office. There's a picture of it at the Airborne Museum in St. Mary-Glees. And he gave him a large brass torch to keep the flame of this alive. And he sent General Giraud to represent him there. But there was never going to be any politicalization of what happened there. We should go, in my own view, and take time to go around those grave sites and to understand what our ancestors did and to thank them for the world they helped create. And now it's up to us to make sure that it comes out all right. But anyway, that's just a thought for this afternoon.
I can see why Susan is an international expert on security. Richard, you were talking about the weather forecasting then, and of course the weather forecasting in those days was really in its infancy, totally so. And it was the Air Force that actually sort of drove it on to a great extent, wasn't it? Because it was Group Captain James Stagg who was the man in charge of giving weather reports to General Eisenhower at the time. One of the places they were getting information from was a place called Black Sod. You'd have to change its name nowadays. It's in Ireland, and it's a lighthouse. And there was one particular lady there called Maureen Sweeney, whose job was to take down weather reports. And the Germans didn't have access to any of this, and we shouldn't have had access to it because the Irish government at the time was neutral. But we were able to get those reports, and they were sent all coded back to Britain from Maureen. And it was through those reports, because it was so far to the west, that they were able to identify a break in the weather, but the Germans weren't. Which is why the Germans were all off visiting their wives and doing war games in different places. They weren't expecting us to land on June the 6th. They thought the weather was in there for the ride. We knew differently, however. Did he ever talk about James Stagg?
No, my discussions for that sort of period with my father were very shallow.
Yeah.
No, he didn't. But I'm interested because I have as you know, the maps which were put before him. And I don't know how these were drawn up, but they're quite interesting because they cover Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, 4th, 5th, 6th of June.
And it was having that information so far to the west of weather that was coming in from the west that actually gave us the window.
I think this is what acted in favour of the Allied forces, that they had contact coming in from the west where the wind was coming, whereas the Luftwaffe were very much limited as to what was over and above them, and north and south, which meant that they didn't get the benefit of the forward planning, where the weather in the UK always comes from the west.
Yes. And the Germans, as I say, didn't have access to any of that information, so thought it was in for the kill, so to speak. We weren't going to land. I just sort of wondered when it was that Susan was talking about and Henry were talking about the moment when they worked out their father was that important. I wonder when it was for you.
That's a very difficult question because one's parent is always important. And Dad, when he was important, he was also Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. So when I matriculated on this little finger, I had a chance to think, well, really, Dad's really more important than I'd given him given any grace for. But you know, you take your parents for granted I'm
Yes.
afraid, in some ways.
Higher education. He was also a director of the BBC, of course.
Yes, he was, and even closer to my particular heart, he was chairman of Standard Triumph, and he offered me a car.
Ah,
And as some of the family will know, I said, Dad, I know what car I want. He said, well, I'll give you one. I said, Dad, I don't want that. And the car that I wanted is parked out here, it was brought down by my son yesterday, an MGA twin cam. So that was another family ruckus that I managed to survive.
that's right, yes. Even I couldn't afford one of those now. I really couldn't. And Will, owe it to you. Ramsay, of course, you've mentioned some of the bits and pieces that you talked about, but when did he become sort of famous in your eyes?
He was always present. There was his portrait was present in the house
Right.
from when I was a wee nipper, and I can't remember when, but I first became aware of his importance. But I think one always looks up to grandparents, and certainly when I learnt the scale of what he was involved in, it kind of, I thought, well, I've got a quarter of his genes. I've got to do something.
There's got to be something there. Right. It was, you then, all four of you take very different courses, of course. You all sort of move off into very different areas, doing different things. And I'm sort of fascinated to know whether, in fact, you mentioned genes just then, whether you think any of those organised, because it was all really about organisation more than anything else. It was about organising not only their lives and what they were doing, but other people below them, and then more people below them, and then thousands of people and hundreds of thousands beneath them. Great responsibility. And none of us know what, and I'm sure sitting in here, I don't think many of us will be able to say we have ever had that responsibility, because it is tremendous. But interesting to hear your views on being able to take on that responsibility and then carry it through right the way to the end, knowing that some of the consequences are actually fatal. Not an easy thing to do, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that responsibility is really quite extraordinary, and I had an opportunity to watch a man manage even a lot of extremely stressful, important things during his presidency, and I have to tell you, I just don't know how he did it. He did help all of us, and so did my grandmother, with what I would call sort of visualization exercises before it became quite the thing. He used to suggest that you get something out of in here and put it on a table or a chair and walk around it to look at it separately. I also think that he said something that I have now repeated in at least 2 books, just because I think it's so important, but I'm in receipt of a considerable number of family letters, also between his letters with my grandmother and also his letters to his parents-in-law, so these are intimate letters, but he wrote his mother-in-law saying that he wanted her to understand that human beings are more emotional and sentimental than they are logical or intellectual. And then he had a prescription about how to handle other people's emotions and to understand that people often have perfectly legitimate, in the context of their lives, reasons for doing what they do, and not to depend on people to be analyzing every situation, but just being themselves, that kind of thing. And I think that really stood him in good stead, is to understand that we're a bunch of complex animals that are trying very hard to do the right thing, but we're also subject to the emotions of love and fear and humiliation and pride, and all of those things go into making us who we are. And so I've been quite guided by him in that respect. But again, I would just say in closing that the stress, he never became hard or bitter. And I find that extraordinary too. He might have had his little moments where he was upset with something, but nothing ever lasted. It never lasted. And I'm grateful to him because I think of him sometimes and then I crawl back from yes, I rethink my approach to things. I'll put it that way.
Do you find the same, Henry?
Well, I won't answer that directly, but I mean, interestingly, the four of us only met this morning for the first time all together. And we, shortly afterwards, we got into grandfather's car, his Rolls Royce, which you might have seen. And we were sitting in the back. And one of the things we were talking about was what it must have been like for the four of them. In that period, in the intensity of the planning, they were busy. But in that period, when D-Day started, what must it have been like for them? Because suddenly, everything was totally out of their control. And we were discussing amongst ourselves how they might have dealt with that. And I just relayed a completely unrelated, but possibly connected observation, which was a part of a discussion I'd had with one of the veterans I was with this week, who talked about, he sort of got into conversation about what it was actually like on the day he landed and what was going through, and he has absolutely no recollection whatsoever of the moment the landing craft, when the ramp came down. He has no recollection of bodies falling beside him, and his just objective was to get off the beach and onto the into safety at the other side of the beach, where he sat down and sort of looked back, and then suddenly it was like the adrenaline came out of his body, and he realized what was going on. And in a sense, that might have been like a little bit like that, but for our ancestors on that moment when there's nothing they could do, and it was out of control. But perhaps a measure of their ability as leaders, which very few people are privileged to have, was their ability to actually cope with that.
May I just add, and project optimism.
Yeah.
This is the discipline that they all demonstrated, which is just extraordinary,
Yes,
really.
it is going to work. We
And
know it's
trust.
going to work because, yes.
And they all had to be able to delegate and trust in people and inspire people. And I remember my father used to say he was just the right sort of person in the right place at the right time. And so they were the right age, they'd had the right experience in World War I or whatever it was. They were all very different. I know my grandfather, our grandfather, there's four Ramsey grandchildren and 4 Ramsey great-grandchildren here. He didn't ingratiate himself with everyone, not with some of his bosses, but I think they probably were all pretty individual and strident in their opinions, and that sort of got them where they were. And then they all had to work together, different nationalities. I know there were 7 different Allied navies. I think there were 11 on the land forces. I think there were 11 different nationalities, or possibly more. And they had to make everyone work together. And on the leadership side, there was friction, and at every level there would have been friction.
Yeah, there were. I just sort of did some research on the Royal Navy at the time. You'd be quite surprised that the Royal Navy in 1944 consisted of 61 battleships and cruisers, 59 aircraft carriers, 846 destroyers and frigates, and 729 minesweepers. We currently have 2 aircraft carriers and 6 guided missile destroyers and 11 frigates. And actually, one of the ships that's in commission is HMS Victory, which and actually consists of 4% of the Navy at the moment. It was slightly bigger in grandfather's day. Yes. But also we've got Richard here as well. Richard, you're a man who's taken on some of that responsibility at times as a virologist in doing research into things. that could well cure or sometimes even not cure people's lives. So you've gone through that process in a similar sort of way, I suppose.
Well, yes, because I mean, I was a junior at then it existed Middlesex Hospital and medical school attached to that, and this very strange illness started popping up in people who were injecting drugs, and we were also seeing it in young men who had male sexual partners. And to some of us, this rang a bell. This is strange. This is not. This must be an infection, and a lot of people refused to believe that this was a simple infection which could be passed, because it had massive ramifications for us in the transfusion practice, because we had to provide blood for people, we had to provide factor VIII for people, for haemophiliacs, and give them a lifestyle, a common sort of ordinary life. And this came at the risk of importing infections. And there was a really very difficult period in trying to balance the advantages of having access to blood and the disadvantages of having access to unknown agents.
Yes.
And I can remember the real difficulties we're in when this horrible disease of men with bad chests and things was spreading, and it started coming into people who were injecting drugs. And those of us who were microbiologists like me, who worked with viruses, said, well, hey chaps, this has got to be an infection.
Yeah.
And it took quite some time for this to be realized, that what we were seeing was the emergence of something new, which became the human immunodeficiency virus, which we all now know as HIV.
Yes, those sort of consequences of making those decisions, major decisions that were made in this very area all those 80 years ago, really quite telling. Can I finish by asking each of you, because for some, I think for all of you, it's your first experience of coming to Southwark and revisiting Southwark House. What are your just impressions of what's going on here? Because there are some people who say, no, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be celebrating this because of the deaths, you should be commemorating, and that's all you should be doing. And what your thoughts are, Henry, of what you've discovered today and this weekend?
Well, it's been a great privilege to be here, and I think I would say that anything and everything that continues to tell the story of what happened 80 years ago, and obviously that balance between commemoration and celebration is a delicate one, but everything that we can do to remember what happened and remember the sacrifices that were made for our freedom is worthwhile, and anything that continues that has to be applauded. So I think it's fantastic what you're doing, and you know, there's nothing wrong with having a bit of fun while you're doing that.
Thank you very much, Henry. Susan, same question?
Well, I have to say I've been to Southwick House before, and I came to, at Henry Montgomery's invitation.
For the 75th.
And on the 75th, we hosted a dinner for the British veterans and crossed the Channel together. Now, I can't tell you what that meant to me, Henry. I really regard it as one of my very favorite memories of coming here. But you know, it is a double, there's a duality. Those who died would not want us to be anything other than joyful about what they accomplished. So it's okay to be in a celebratory mood, but I think then we also want to lay our flowers on the graves and thank them. I think it was Eisenhower, D-Day plus 20 years with Walter Cronkite when he went back to the beaches. And Walter Cronkite asked him, how, when he was looking at these grave sites, you know, what did he think? Now, I will shorten this up because my time has come to an end, but he said, these boys gave us another chance. And that is cause for celebration as well as commemoration.
Will?
I have had a real sense of community spirit today and wanting to celebrate and remember. And hats off to everyone who's made the effort to dress up and and relive that spirit. And I'd love to come back again another year. I hope it's going in many more years. And I would just encourage, there aren't many people here under 18. There aren't many people here under 30 or 40. And so bring someone younger next time.
Yeah.
Very good point. Richard.
I couldn't say that in a better way. I think we need to, I don't use the peremptory term educate, but we need to make young people aware of the history, what they owe, what we owe people who participated in this period. And I would almost say that the dreadful loss of life, it was an awful loss of life, but it was lives which were lost for a very valuable future which we hold now in our hands. And without the commitment and the bravery of the individuals involved, we wouldn't be here. And that's an awful thing to say. This country would not be what it currently is. And that's, I don't know if that's a justification for the loss, but, you know, thank you, people, for it.
Very much so. I'd like to thank all who've taken part today. Their insights and opinions have really been quite enlightening to me, very good. But I think thanks... Even the animals believe me. More than that, though, thanks really should go to all the men who took part in that momentous endeavour on D-Day. We will remember them at the going down of the sun and in the morning. And the villagers of Southwick should take pride in both commemorating those who didn't return and also those celebrating the achievements of the world-changing day that they created on D-Day. Eisenhower wrote this note on the morning of the day the decision was taken to go. Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I've withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it's mine alone. He didn't, of course, have to send that note, and the bravery, devotion and duty, and indeed sheer tenacity of all of those who took part resulted in the freedoms that we all cherish and we live by today, of course. They knew that what they were fighting for, they succeeded in the most determined way. And our thanks now and forever should go to them. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been planned for about 12 months now. Quite a lot of work went into tracking down these four characters and persuading them to come to Southwick, to our little village, and to help us to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day in such a way. I was encouraged by conversations with the likes of James Holland and Dan Snow and other people at Chalk Valley History Festival last year, who said that if you can achieve this, Martin, this will be a world first and something of enormous significance. But when I went into the Elms this morning, and these three on this side were having breakfast together, I thought that's rather nice. And then Henry, who had an overnight crossing from Normandy, arrived and came upstairs with Arabella. And the greeting that they made to each other, having never met before, I found quite emotional. I'm sure they felt quite emotional. I think it's been quite a charged day. I'm really proud that we've managed to achieve this. And thank you all for coming.